Welcome back to the month of Valifor here on A Year of Final Fantasy, and unofficially it's the month of the Chocobo. And this month we're reviewing the spin-off series of the Final Fantasy games known as Chocobo's Dungeon, in which there are 3 major games in that particular series. Chocobo's Dungeon series made its debut on the PlayStation back in Japan during December of 1997, followed by a subsequent sequel of Chocobo's Dungeon 2 in December 1998 for Japan, and just about half a year later or so during November of 1999 for the rest of the world in the West. And finally, a third entry entitled Final Fantasy Fables, Chocobo's Dungeon, made its debut on the Wii during December 2007 for Japan, and again about a half a year later on July 8th for the States. It was also ported to the DS in 2008, but that was for Japan only. So what is this Chocobo Dungeon series? Well, it's a dungeon crawling game taking inspiration from roguelikes and action RPGs like Blizzard's Diablo series, which is probably one of the most popular types of roguelikes, and some may even disagree that it's a roguelike, but it's used to describe these Chocobo Dungeon games because that's the closest I can possibly get to describing them. And the Chocobo's Dungeon series doesn't really have combat like the traditional Final Fantasy games with battle screens and things like that. Instead, the game's combat takes place on the exploration map. Still though, the game does have a turn-based nature and isn't really a real-time sort of affair like a Diablo type of game or even like a Final Fantasy 15 type of game. The Chocobo's Dungeon games usually feature a small story, and we could get into the story, but honestly, it's really obviously clear, like many games in this genre, that the focus is on the dungeon crawling and the loot grinding. The game takes inspiration from their forefathers, creating randomly generated dungeons with loot and monsters, so each time you play, you won't necessarily have the same experience twice. The mechanics of the battle system is such that whenever you're moving around the dungeon, each step advances time by 1 turn. So basically, if you take a step, then the enemies get to take a step, or they can take an action, or whatever. In this way, you can use some strategy with the environment to plan out how you're going to dispatch the enemies while avoiding traps and other hazards. The way attacks are handled in these games have varied slightly from game to game, where some are strictly turn-based attacks, others use kind of like a modified ATB gauge, but other than that, they are on a sort of turn-based type of system. As you might expect, the series has many elements of Final Fantasy incorporated into it. Some of the big ones here that kind of reappear that you would expect would be like Cid, for instance, as well as a lot of older music from the games that's kind of remixed in some way, shape, or form. Magic, items, equipment, all of that stuff appears here with the Final Fantasy isms like you would expect, for instance, like the naming schemes. For example, we have Fire and Fira and Faraga and Cura, Curaga, that type of thing. While the games do feature all the loot and items and everything, they're handled slightly differently with each particular game. But that being said, in these games you'll normally find a crafting system of some sort, and it's no different here, where you can combine basic items. It's not super complicated crafting system, and you can get even more powerful items. Again, if you've played a roguelike game or Diablo game, you know the drill. Our main character is Chocobo here. It's not Boko, it's just Chocobo, and he explores the dungeon, and you'll also have some helper characters accompanying you, ranging from a wide variety of people or monsters or entities or just, whatever's living, I guess. And with that, the job aspect can be seen in this particular section of the game, being that you can't really customize a job in the PlayStation games, like, for instance, say Final Fantasy V, but whenever you have people accompanying you, they have normally a specific job type of role, such as a white mage or black mage, and you can expect them to function as white or black mages do. Anyway, the point here is that you're not always alone. It's not just Chocobo's Dungeon, and it's really cool to see how they've incorporated this, which can change your strategy in dealing with a lot of enemies. A little fun bonus here is that since you do have companion characters, you can have a friend take up the arms of the second player for a little bit of co-op action, which is always fun. Though the PlayStation games lack a coherent job system, the proper Wii game has a limited selection of jobs that you can use to give your Chocobo various stats and abilities, and that kind of spices up the different ways of playing. All in all, Chocobo's Dungeon series is, to me, an absolutely awesome series. That being said, certainly it can be seen as maybe a cheap cash-in and just a derivative of the more popular roguelikes and other action RPG dungeon crawling games. However, I would like to look at it as paying homage to the great games with a Final Fantasy twist, similar to how Final Fantasy Explorers sort of took the Monster Hunter formula and Final Fantasy Eyes did. So if you get a chance, definitely check the games out, especially if you enjoy that kind of gameplay. The Wii version of the game is relatively cheap now, and it'll give you a pretty good solid experience. I'm actually not sure about PlayStation's Chocobo's Dungeon 2. To my knowledge, it hasn't been released on any kind of virtual console or console store at the time of this recording, and the original game was actually Japanese only, but there do exist some English patches out there if you want to go down that route. Don't go and just search for the original game because it doesn't actually exist in English. So yeah, Chocobo's Dungeon series, it's a great little series and absolutely a hidden gem that few people really ever talk about. I mean, when's the last time you've heard somebody talk about Chocobo's Dungeon? But the games do deserve a spotlight. I remember a lot of fond memories with Chocobo's Dungeon 2 for the PlayStation, and I've only dipped my toe into the Wii version, and this may actually make me go and give it a solid shot. Anyway, next time on A Year of Final Fantasy, we're obviously gonna keep on going with more Chocobos, whatever. And what crazy genre has Chocobo gotten himself into next? Who knows, but we're going to be diving into that next time, so until then, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.